kept item, something that you have kept for not practical reasons, but because there's a story behind it, sentimental reasons. And how when you extract that memory and they ask yourself certain questions that I call the wonder questions, who, what, where, when, why, you can weave a narrative out of the emotions that accompany the memory behind it. So I'm going to start with an anecdote of my own. This incident took place on a summer day in 1970 in the Midwest, at a place where the Mississippi River separates Illinois from Missouri at a very wide place. And in the middle of the river there's an island, and on the island there's a restaurant, old restaurant that serves down-home comfort food, biscuits and gravy, blackened catfish, chicken fried steak. And right next to the restaurant there's an old barn that houses an antique store. So to get to the island, you drive down this narrow blacktop road to the banks of the Mississippi, and there's a ferry, an old ferry that will take 4 or 5 cars at a time over to the island. So I had a friend visiting from out of town, and I was showing him around, and we had each ingested a handful of psilocybin mushrooms, which was very common in those days. And so we were, definitely in an altered state. We took the ferry over, and we're at the antique show or store, and I came across this photo, or one very much like it. It's not really a photo, it's like a daguerreotype or tintype, whatever you call these old photos. And you'll notice that in them, nobody's smiling. You really can't smile because it takes so long to develop the plates that you have to maintain the same expression for a long period of time. So I'm sitting and looking at this photo, and it's like they're staring at me and I'm staring at them. And suddenly they came alive. They started moving, and they were no longer staring at me or at the camera. They're talking to each other, taking their hats off, wiping the sweat off their forehead, spitting tobacco into the dust. It was as real as though I was looking out the window of my kitchen, and they were right outside. And I could also feel and hear what they were thinking. And they're worried about the war. Are they going to be blown up? Why do they have to go to war? What's going to happen to their wife and kids? Who's going to bring in the crops or take care of the animals? And you might say, well, this was an illusion caused by the mushrooms, but I'd say that the mushrooms were really just like a catalyst that opened a door on something called the Akashic Records. Akasha from an ancient Tibetan word, Aka meaning space and Sa meaning hidden. So the Akashic Records are really like a hidden library of indelible impressions of everything that has ever occurred. I put together this definition for my own research, and there are certain key words. The word accessible, meaning that everything that exists on the Akashic Records you have access to. And that the key words ever will be produced, meaning that what is stored there is not only what has happened in the past, but everything that will happen in the future is already stored on the Akashic Records. And they're not just records of what has occurred to humans on this planet, but to every conscious being throughout the universe from the beginning to the end of time. Sometimes called the Eye of God, also called the Mind of God or Universal Mind, Universal Consciousness, Cosmic Consciousness, Collective Unconscious, the Matrix, or by this woman, H.P. Blavatsky, the Indestructible Tablets of Astral Light. She actually coined the term Akashic Records. She was a founder of the Theosophical Society that studied these sorts of things. You'll find reference to the records throughout all religions, throughout history, throughout the world. Tibetan Buddhists, you may have heard of the term Atman, which is their word for soul. And they believe that the Atman records every moment of human existence, analogous to the Akashic Records. In Christianity, they're referred to as the Book of Life. You'll see them referred to in the Old Testament and the New Testament, sometimes also called the Book of Remembrance. And this book, you can see St. Peter at the gates of heaven deciding who gets in and who doesn't, referring to the Book of Life, sort of a Christian mythology, but it's more than mythology. And also the phenomenon of your entire life flashing before your eyes at the moment of death is attributed to the Akashic records. Now this guy, French visionary and prophet, you've probably heard of him. He accessed the Akashic record set using methods derived from the Greek oracles, Christian and Sufi mysticism, and the Kabbalah. This guy, American clairvoyant, while in a trance state, could access knowledge possessed by millions of other human beings. And he attributed his ability to do this to the Akashic records. This guy, C.W. Leadbeater, is a contemporary of H.P. Blavatsky. He wrote the book in 1913, Man, How, Once, and Whither. He wrote the history of Atlantis by accessing the Akashic records. And he also wrote the history of the 28th century, which of course has not yet arrived, so how is that possible? Carl Jung, I'm sure you heard of him. A lot of scholars say that his concept of collective unconscious is analogous to the Akashic records. More recently, Irvin Laszlo, who's a systems theorist, philosopher of science, his theories of cosmic memory or quantum consciousness are taken very seriously by scientists today, especially physicists. And Akashic records are responsible for a lot of phenomenon that you might be familiar with, including voodoo. So you might say, well, what's this got to do with me? Everything, really, because without the Akashic records, you really couldn't be an artist or a writer. You have to have access to memories, perhaps memories that are not even your own, in order to create characters that you are not personally familiar with. Let's say, for example, that you're writing a story, and one of your characters is called down to the morgue to identify the body of your spouse, your best friend, your husband or wife, and you've never had this experience or anything like it. So, you know, there could be grave apprehension, horror, denial, and you want your character to exhibit these, to have these emotions, but you've never felt them. So somehow you have to do it authentically, you have to be able to access that kind of emotion, and they are available to you on the level of the Akashic records. You just have to get there. You recall that the Akashic records, they're not subject to duration, or what we call cause and effect. One thing happens and the next thing happens in a sequence. At the level of the Akashic records, everything happens at the same time. So the future already exists, which makes it, and all the emotions that have ever been experienced or will be experienced in the future already exist, and they're available to you. So what does that mean to you as a writer? Let's say you write historical fiction. You can imagine that people that existed 2,000 years ago, or 4,000 or 10,000 years ago, they not only have different things on their mind, but the very subjective, emotional consciousness would have to have been different than ours. So if you're writing about somebody that existed that long ago, you don't want to just take a 21st century character and dress him up in the costume of your day. You want to be able to access something a little bit more authentic so that your characters are authentic. Or let's say, conversely, you write future fiction. Now this guy is 98% android and 2% human. But if you're going to write from a close point of view about a character, 1,000 years from now, and that's him, then you have to access that 2% somehow, and by visiting the Akashic record, you can do this. Or let's say you write fantasy, fairy tales, universes that may exist parallel to our own. You are going to want to do something special by getting inside the mind and heart of other creatures. So you say, okay, I'll buy it. How do I do it? There are ways, traditional methods, conventional methods of accessing the records. Either some of the, the secret ways that high priests might do it throughout history. But then there's meditation, prayer, yoga, different religious practices that will get you there. Or you can do it accidentally, randomly, deep sleep, sleep deprivation, extreme fatigue, illness, fear, psychedelic drugs, a lot of different ways for this to suddenly occur. You might not even be aware that it's happening and can't take advantage of it. But we're not gonna like give you drugs, we're not gonna put you to sleep, hopefully, or teach you methods of meditation. We're just gonna ask you to think about it. Ask yourself who, what, where, when you're examining an object that you've kept for some reason. And the answers that you get are going to invoke certain emotions, and those emotions can weave themselves together into a narrative that might be a piece of memoir because the narrative is what really happened. But other things start to happen, and perhaps you're going to turn that into a work of fiction or a piece of poetry. Now, something that's good to keep in mind is that the records are said to be guarded by certain guardians of the Akashic Records who can limit your access or allow you in. And these guardians are synonymous with the mythical muse that we're also fond of referring to. So it's very important that, one, you ask in the right way. You're very nice about trying to be inspired. And two, that you get very lucky. And if you get very lucky, you might get some of these sweet and sympathetic muses that are happy to help and give you whatever information or feelings or streams of genius that you want. But if you're not lucky, you might get one of these guys who are not so surly and sympathetic, and they block your access to the records, and you sit at your typewriter and don't get anything done. So let's take a look at some of the works that we read and see how these guys use objects to create their work. This guy, Raymond Carver, you probably all read him. Photograph of My Father in His 22nd Year was a poem, but his work was kind of a genre bender. It's a poem, it's a slice of memoir inspired by a photograph, rendered as a poem and inserted into an essay called My Father's Life. When he wrote it, he no longer had the photograph that inspired it. He wasn't even alive when the photograph was taken. It was a photograph of his father, and his father's got a beer can in one hand and a string of fish in the other. He's got his hat on crooked and a really stupid grin on his face, and like he's trying to be a certain kind of person. And years later, after his father died, his mother gave him the photograph, and he carried it around with him when he moved from place to place. And when he finally sat down at an apartment in San Francisco and decided to examine his relationship with his father, he remembered this photograph. And so just by concentrating and contemplating his memory of the photograph, he was able to come to an understanding of himself and his alcoholism, and especially who his father was, or who he pretended to be. He was able to see that all by contemplating not even the photograph, but a memory of the photograph. This woman, Sandra, have you heard of Sandra Cisneros? The poets probably have. She also wrote House on Mango Street, which is a very, her big thing. Well, this particular poem was inspired by an actual photograph, and in it she was able to tell, just a few lines, the history of her life and the history of her parents' life. When the photograph was taken, she was in it, but she was just a baby being held by her mother. The mother's very happy, the father's happy, he's handsome, he's got great shoes. What's missing from the photograph is the woman who came along later and disrupted the marriage and made her mother very unhappy, and also the knowledge that the mother doesn't have or would never have, that Sandra didn't turn out so well. Another poem that's probably your favorite, Trees by Joyce Kilmer, which is like really panned by critics for good reason. The question about trees, has everyone read Trees at some point in their life? The question is whether or not there was an actual tree that was used to inspire Kilmer, who's a man, by the way, Joyce Kilmer. And his wife and son said no, there was, you know, he wrote the poem sitting in a study, there's a window overlooking the woods with lots of trees. But they said no, there's no particular tree that inspired the poem, but I think it might have been this one, which is doing exactly as he describes in his poem, raising its leafy arms to pray. I had to sneak up on the tree in the dark to take the picture, that's why you can see the flash. This next poem, John Gardner, who wrote On Becoming a Novelist. Now, I don't think the poem was ever published, and he didn't intend it to be published because he wanted to give an example of the process of writing in an essay that later became On Becoming a Novelist. So he said, look, you can take any object, and just by examining the attributes of this object, and it's going to invoke certain emotions and images, you can write a poem. And so he wrote this poem, which isn't very good, but you can see how also an inanimate object can inspire you to apply certain emotions to the attributes of it. This story is a rather long story by Ann Beatty. I won't do a synopsis of the story. I'll just say that the bowl itself was the total focus of the story, and by the end of the story, there's just the character Andrea, the real estate agent, and the bowl, and she's contemplating the bowl, and it's a deeply subtle psychological tale about a relationship of one person to an inanimate object. So the question I had was whether or not there really was such an object that the author fictionalized a story around. Did she have a bowl that she bought at a craft fair, or her lover bought for her and she wrote the story but fictionalized it? Or did she have such a bowl but it had no emotional attachment, she bought it at a yard sale or a Target? Or no bowl at all, it was just except the one that existed in her imagination. And by examining the bowl in her imagination, she was able to weave the narrative of this story. I did some research to find out, I read all of her interviews, she never mentions the source of the inspiration for the bowl. Now this, Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket, Jack Finney. Jack Finney is the author of Time and Again, you heard of that? A novel. And Body Snatchers, you may have heard of that. But he also wrote short stories. This was written in 1954. And it is about a guy who is so obsessed with his career as an advertising executive that he neglects his wife and everything of value in life. He's doing a research to impress his bosses, and all of his research notes are on a sheet of paper. So he's on the 11th floor of his apartment building in Manhattan with the window up, and his wife is going to the show, and she says, come on, go with me. No, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to do my work. He opens the window, and a wind sucks the paper out, and it lands on the ledge, and he has to go out there and get it. So he crawls out on the ledge, grabs the paper, but the window slams behind him. So now he's out there, he can't get in, the window's stuck. He needs to get somebody's attention. He starts throwing out the contents of his pockets, hoping somebody will notice down below. And he's finding everything's gone, there's nothing left except that scrap of paper. And he's looking at it going, if somebody finds this, it's going to be totally meaningless to them. It doesn't mean anything to anybody but me. And he realized it's really the story of a wasted life. And he has a sudden epiphany at that point in time. He crawls back and he crashes through the glass with his elbow, and he manages to get back inside. And he decides, the hell with this project, I'm going to go find my wife at the theater. And another wind comes along and pulls the paper out the window, and he just laughs. And he exits the apartment, and that's the end of the story. So the question here is, did something inspire him? Was there a piece of yellow paper with notes on it that he thought about and and imagine the story? Well, it's a possibility. And I can imagine a lot of stories around that that would explain how he came to write the story based on a real piece of yellow paper, but that's for another time. This next story, and it's my story, but I didn't include it because I thought it was a great story. It's because I don't have to speculate about the origins of the story, because I know exactly where it came from. One night I was listening to National Public Radio, and there was a little human interest blurb that came on about a woman, an elderly woman who lived alone in a little house on the outside of a little town in the Midwest. And she calls the police and complains that somebody is stealing her plastic flamingos one at a time. And she's really distraught because she says, they're all that I have. So the small town police set up surveillance, but they don't catch anybody. And pretty soon all of her flamingos are gone, one by one. So I thought that was really interesting, and I made a note in a journal that I was keeping at that time. And then years later, I came across a postcard, much like this, not exactly this postcard because I no longer have it. And that reminded me of the journal entry, so I went back to the journal entry, and it was really interesting to read it, and that inspired me to write a story, creating a fictional account of the woman living alone, losing her flamingos. Now, at that time, I was living in a situation of kind of forced separation from family and friends, and I had to sort of review my life and see how I got to the place where I was at. And that is analogous to her creating the tapestry, weaving the tapestry. If you read the story, I know that that's how she spends her time. And what I had to do at that time was reconcile myself to my situation and even find contentment in the situation. And so even though her story is entirely fictional, the emotions that I was feeling and that were later called back to me by both the postcard and the journal entry were the emotions that she felt at that time. So that in a way the story is like a parallel story of my own, but using plastic pink flamingos and an old woman on a farm instead of the true situation. So that's the end of the lecture, and that is basically how you can go about using some kind of object or photograph to create a narrative of your own, whether it's a piece of memoir or fiction, nonfiction, poetry, or a movie script. So did anyone bring an object with them that they can share and pass around and tell us what they arrived at when they examined it and ask some questions about it?
I have an object.
You have an object? All right. Oh, great. Look at this.
Is that in your room?
Holy cow. Would you mind passing it around? Everybody take
Yes.
about 10 seconds to take a look at it. Are you smelling it?
Yeah, it really has a nice
No,
smell
it's
to
good.
it. Just wait.
No.
Oh, yeah, it does.
When we talk about the literary canon, that's what's really.
Do you know what type of wood it is?
You know, I was trying to figure that out. I don't know if it's stained or if it's, it looks like there's not, so it might be stained pine, I'm not sure.
But it's interesting that you smell it because, you know, the senses are when they're involved. So if you ask yourself, how did it smell?
Yeah.
Is it a toy, or where did you get this like that?
This is from a gift shop that my grandparents were running in Beirut about 45 years ago.
Okay, so if you ask yourself when did you acquire it 45 years ago? Who gave it to you? Your grandparents? Why did they give it to you?
They were closing the store, and they had a bunch of things
Closing
left
this
over,
over.
and they gave this to my family, my mother, and she gave it to me. She put it in my room.
Right. So why were they closing the store?
There was no business.
What's that?
There was no business, somebody was going in there.
So when you look at the object and ask yourself those questions, what kind of answers do you get? What kind of narrative does it create for you?
I've been thinking about that all morning. I guess it'd be, it would be about a gift, something similar to the Janice story, actually.
That somebody gave you?
Yeah, the Janice story was made a huge impression on me. This is something like that bowl, I think.
Mhm. Where do you keep them?
I keep it on my room, just on a shelf. It's always been around.
Does it make you think of your grandparents?
Yeah. No, it does.
And why did you say they closed the store?
There wasn't business in that
Oh,
part
not
of
enough
town.
business. So
It was
the
in the-
economy was down?
I don't know what the problem was. That was just when the war was starting, but it was also, I think they closed in the early 70s. I think they were in a part where there wasn't much foot traffic in that area anyway. It was located, the store was located up in the ground floor of their apartment building.
Mm-hmm. Did they live upstairs?
Yeah, they did.
I wonder if they were sad that they had to close the store, like mark sort of a closure in their own life.
Probably, at that point, my grandfather was retired, so he was an engineer. So, yeah, probably that was.
And that's really all they had to connect them maybe to the outside world.
Yeah.
End of an era, end of the country,
Exactly.
point in history.
Did you say this was Beirut?
Yes, yeah.
So, and where did your grandparents go?
They went to the United States. My uncle and father arranged for them to leave the country. I don't know if they got the green cards then or later, but they left, and my uncle bought a house for them. And then they had to go back a few years later and sell the apartment and pack everything up and ship it back to Boston. So I can't remember when this was given to us. We went to Beirut on a trip. I was 3 years old. They may have given it to us then, because I've always remembered this thing being around.
So did they give it to your parents and your parents gave it
Yeah.
to you?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the time. There was a movie called The Red Violin.
Yeah, it was a good movie. Yeah,
Isn't that good?
yeah, really good.
It's like an object, and the story wasn't about the object, but it was a beautiful red violin owned by a person, probably a musician. And then you see his life, and then something happens and the violin gets passed on to somebody else. And now a new story begins that segues off the first story. And there are about 3 or 4 or 5 stories in a row as the object keeps getting handed down from one individual to another. Great. Anyone else bring anything?
So,
What do you have?
so I have a photo, it's the photo on my wall, so I'll just pass it around. So it's a photo of I was in Portugal, walking through Portugal 2 years ago, and came to this little city called Gaeta, and I turned the corner into the city, and suddenly this whole pedestrian street was covered with umbrellas, primary color umbrellas, and it was a bright blue
Is that
day.
what this is?
Yeah, so, and it was just so cool, it was just so beautiful, it was so unexpected, and It's the first time I've ever been in Europe, so it was, I was seeing all sorts of new things, and as it turns out, a lot of those streets had different color umbrellas, and, you know, it works in two things, like, first of all, like, it provides shade, but then, you have different designs of, like, shading, like, on the street, so, I don't know, it's such a vivid memory.
Vivid, yeah.
Vivid memory, and it always just makes me smile, so, there you go.
So you're working on a memoir right now about that trip?
Yeah, I am, yep, in my IS,
Oh, wow.
so.
So when you look at that picture, it all comes flooding back?
Yeah, actually, I met I was doing the Camino de Santiago, which is a pilgrimage that's pretty popular in Europe, and it descends, they have 33 routes that descends on Santiago de Compostela, which is in northwest Galicia, Spain.
So it's different than the one that the movie?
Yeah, so the movie, if you've ever seen The Way, they go across the top of Spain. I did what they call the Portuguese route, so I went from Lisbon north. So I basically got to walk and see 2/3 of Portugal, which is pretty amazing. And I was the only American who was doing the Portuguese route, so I met all these people. I met this woman, Christina, and that's who I walked into the city with that day, and we were actually having coffee. We had crossed the river into Algeta. We're having awesome espresso and this pastry called Mfa, which means 1,000 leaves, which is this really flaky pastry, and it has custard in the middle, and then it has this really delectable icing on it. It's really great. So when we turned the corner together, and this is what we saw. So it was just, and we were just saying, like, what a perfect, like, it was just such a perfect day. And you don't get many days like that where we just had beautiful walking, we really hit it off, so we've been together walking for 10 hours, and it just didn't seem like that, and we hit this beautiful street, and we kept hitting street after street, and we were looking for an albergue, which is like pilgrim hostel, and they had, in the center of town, I couldn't believe it, but where all these shops were, they had music playing, and they were actually playing the Eagles, Hotel California, and so we kind of went out of the center, and we were going to the hostel, and here was this really decrepit looking building, and I was like, oh my God, this is like Hotel California. But, you know, I mean, the albergues, they just didn't have a lot of money. They was really clean and everything, but it was a really funny moment. We met up with another pilgrim who we never thought we'd see again, so it was just a really great day, and it just sort of showed for it, and I know this is a really corny phrase, so I would never write this, but I'm just going to say it. It was a really magical day, and but it just, in that photo just brings it all back, so.
So why did you go on the trip? Do you recall what you were going through at the time, what motivated you, like the wild, you know?
Yeah, so I think what motivated me is I was almost 5 years ago now, I was going through a very, very tough time in my life. And so on my arm, I'm sure some of you have seen it, says, "Good to be alive." That's a tattoo. It was better than a sticky note. And I needed to prove that was a true statement. And what I had read about the Camino, and I saw that movie, it seemed like that this could be like a start, like a new beginning. So that was my intention, and I really wanted to kind of connect with people and connect with the world, because I didn't think I was doing that. So so that was my inspiration for going on the Camino. So.
And then when you got back, could you see a noticeable difference between who you were before you left and who you were when you got back? Was that kind of change that you can write into a narrative and wrap it up?
Yeah, because basically I came home from that trip, 2013, and by the end of June of the next year, I was here. And I had never thought of ever writing again, because I was writing in my 20s and I gave it all up, so, wow, that's emotional. So anyway, so it really...
See, emotional content invoked by an object with photographs.
Yeah, so yeah, it definitely, like, I knew coming back from that trip that I wanted to be a writer again. So there you have it.
Anyone else?
I run an object, I don't have as much of a story behind it, or, but I collect like odd items, just to use as writing prompts, and to kind of have a collection, and I found this little box that says family pills, and I just thought, that's so great, because you could use it to go in so many different directions.
So this is an object that you haven't been keeping, but you just came upon it?
I've had it for a while,
Okay.
yeah, I got it in like, an antique collectible store like years ago, and just have been holding on to it to use, whenever I need writing prompts, I kind of have this box of
Cool
odd
stuff.
and strange items to just kind of think about or look
Yeah.
at to, get me going.
So when you look at that one, are you able to recollect how you acquired it, and where you were, and what was going on in your life at that time? Or,
Not so much, it makes me, it's called family pills, so I think of my family and, pill in more of a derogatory aspect than an actual pill. And, you can always write about your family members, so.
yeah, having objects that are not kept objects, impersonal items can do the same thing, a little differently, they don't invoke memories that you have, but you can do what you're doing and just invoke imaginative scenarios that you can turn into a poem or by association. You can see one thing leads to another when the stream of memory starts flowing. No more objects? Okay. There are photographers who arrange still lifes that have meaning, rather than just objects that look nice and the flowers and look at the texture of the flowers and look at the light on the vase, etc. They'll take photographs of objects that seem to be random, but the juxtaposition of the objects create a story. And sometimes they'll just take a picture of objects and imagine a story from that collection or that grouping. But sometimes they will imagine a story first and then find objects that, if they put it together, it tells this story. So I came across a couple of websites that do this sort of thing, and it was very interesting. Here's one. I didn't put the name of the photo. It does have a title that the author or the photographer gave the picture a title. And again, it wasn't clear to me if she had just taken a picture of this at random, or whether she got the idea and then said, if I put this here, much like the way you build a story. You have scenes and you take this out, put this in, decide what order and what goes next to what. And so Stephen Kramer has already agreed that whoever can correctly name this photo gets one free, tuition-free semester here at Wesley. So would anyone like to save a few dollars?
Writer's block.
Stephen's gonna hate you. That's it, yeah, that's it, writer's block, that's what she called it. I just took the name off. Another photographer does a very similar thing. And this one also doesn't have a title. The story's a little less obvious. And when I came across this, I saw it, within 5 minutes I had a story about why there's a dancer's shoe on the keyboard. So in 30 seconds, can anybody come up with some kind of narrative that this grouping of objects, just crazy idea, what does it mean? Why is there asking the wonder questions, who, what, where, when, why? Who put the shoe on the keyboard? Why? When did this happen? Where did it happen? What happened before? What happened after? you can look at that and come up with at least a short story, or probably a poem.
I guess I'm asking why the music has stopped.
Why the music has stopped. That's very good, that's close to what I came up
Great minds.
with. Think alike and so do ours.
That's right, doesn't it?
Any other brief synopsis of something? What's going on here?
I don't know, I get the impression that there's some kind of like affair going on. It's
Oh,
like the shoe
man,
gets thrown
you guys
off.
are too good. I got the same thing.
I was thinking the dancer and the pianist,
Mhm.
together somewhere.
Mm.
The title that I came up with was Dance For Me, Play For Me. And it was an affair. The older piano player is a married man, and the dancer, young dancer. And this is at the little apartment that they have where they meet. He's married, she's not. And, you know, the usual thing where the young woman wants the old guy to leave his wife and family for her because she's more important than all of that, and he won't do it. And so when this occurred, she had just she had gone there alone, he's not there, and she had danced. She imagined him saying, "Dance for me." And she said, "Play for me," and she hears the music in her head and she dances, and then she takes off the shoe and puts it on the keyboard right before she commits suicide, which is where he'll find her, in their little tryst place. And you guys got it, bam. Any other objects or ideas or any questions or anything anybody wants to just say? I brought vodka.
That's an object.
That's
How about the speculative occult theory of the Akashic Records? Does that ring a bell with anybody? Was that absurd?
I've heard about that before, so
Yeah.
interested that you brought it up.
What can we read more about that?
You can go to the literature of the Theosophical Society.
Theosophical?
Theosophical Society. And they have tons and tons of books that they do their own publishing, so you can get them through them. And it's just about everything clairvoyant and telepathic and search for true knowledge.
How do you distinguish that from what we usually talk about as the imagination?
How would I distinguish it? Well,
Yeah.
I'd say it's a source of imagination. You get the illusion that memories are stored in the brain, and ideas and inspiration is stored in the brain and comes from there. But it's really that it filters through the brain from a much more universal, primal source. And actually, the brain is a bad filter. And so you get very little. Sometimes you have ideas and inspiration that's kind of choppy, it's not focused, it comes and goes. It exists in a pure state, but when it gets filtered through the material world, especially through our organs, it's imperfect. And that's the imagination. The more pure, the more effectively it's filtered, the more pure the results will be, and the better that your imagination will serve you to create things. You just have these moments, right, where it just doesn't stop coming. Brilliant stuff, that's the source of genius. So I'd say imagination is, synonymous. It's a consequence of the source of all vibrations, emotions, thoughts. and it accounts for the persistence of memory.
So,
The Akashic Records accounts for the persistence of memory. It's always there.
is that where it came from?
He wrote a book called The Persistence of Memory.
No.
Well, if that's it, great. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you.